I talked about cost-benefit analysis and how to set the optimal level of pollution for both flow pollution and stock pollution. Now let's look at some of the alternatives to cost-benefit analysis, because nobody much likes cost-benefit analysis. And one of the key problems is that in order to do a cost-benefit analysis, what you need to do is make the gains of the polluting activity comparable to the social costs of the pollution, because otherwise you can't equate them at the margin. They have to be measured in the same dimension, and that is much more difficult than I made it out to be, and we'll talk extensively about that. So that is a key problem with cost-benefit analysis. Another problem is that it's based on sort of a technocratic ideal. It's based on utilitarianism, and those things are not particularly popular. So what do people do instead? Well, one way of going about setting standards is to use multicriteria analysis rather than cost-benefit analysis. And essentially, in a multicriteria analysis, there's multiple things that you care about, not just money, or rather, you care about things that cannot necessarily be expressed in money. And then there's two steps to multicriteria analysis. First, you try to find those options that are dominated and exclude those. And with dominated, what people typically mean is that there is a particular strategy, a particular policy intervention that is bad for the economy, that is bad for social justice, and that is bad for the environment. Or rather, there are options that score better in all three dimensions. So you remove those because they're obviously silly things to do. It's regardless of which of the three things that you care about have the priority. It doesn't really matter because they do worse on all three, or sometimes 17 scores. But after you've excluded those things that are obviously silly strategies, then typically what you find is that there's multiple options left. Some do better on the environment, some do better on the economy, some do better on social justice. And then essentially you will need to find trade-offs again, and multicriteria analysis is essentially a more complicated way of making those trade-offs visible and making choices, just like cost-benefit analysis is all about making trade-offs. So that does not really solve any problem. It's just that you move the problem around and you just look at them slightly differently. There are alternative ways, truly alternative ways of standard setting, and I list a number here. One are so-called safe standard or safe minimum standards. We typically see this in medicine or in food, the stuff that we find in the things that we eat and drink. And often what is done there is that essentially food is declared safe if you can feed it to 1,000 rats and only 5 of those rats die. And then that is a measure that you have for how much stuff those rats can take. And then for safety, we divide it by 10. And of course, we are much, much larger than your average rat. And that means that probably you're a factor 100 or 1,000 on the safe side, right? If a particular dose of a particular contaminant kills 5 out of 1,000 rats, if you then feed 1/10 of that dose to a human, then probably you're going to kill not 5 in 1,000, but 5 in 100,000 or 5 in 1,000,000, more likely. And then we say that is a safe way of going about things. That's a safe dose of this particular substance. That's one way of setting a standard. The assumption here is, of course, that there is no real trade-off, that really we want to keep people as healthy as possible and we don't really care about the costs of banning a particular substance or only allowing it in very small doses, right? It's a very one-sided approach to a decision. The costs do not matter, which is true if we're talking about additives to food, right? There's no big costs to leaving those out. So that is one way of setting targets. You can also just go completely the opposite direction and say, well, let's just have a vote about these, what people think the standard should be. Just organize a referendum. The problem with referendum, as people in the UK are now well aware, is that sometimes people make very silly mistakes, that they're lied to by politicians or could not be bothered to inform themselves and therefore let themselves be lied to. So an alternative way to referendums is to organize citizens' journeys, that is, invite a hopefully representative group of people, let them deliberate the problem, let them discuss with themselves, amongst themselves, let them invite expert witnesses and have them cross-examined and then sort of make up their mind. This takes away the problem of being people voting without necessarily being informed about the subject. And that is a way of setting a particular standard. Another way of setting standards is just to say we go for the best available technology. That is, we have an environmental problem, we want to minimize it, so let's just use the state-of-the-art technology. Let's just ban anything that is inferior to the best we can do. There's two problems with this. One is, again, it looks at the problem from one side only. We have an environmental problem, we want to solve it, we don't care about the cost. There is no real trade-off there. We just want to minimize the problem. The other problem is that if you ask an engineer what is the best available technology, they will come up with a very fancy and very expensive solution that, yes, minimizes environmental pollution, but may not be particularly convenient or may not be particularly cheap. So people often add to best available technology not exceeding excessive costs. And then you have somewhat the trade-off there, but there is no real hard definition of what would be an excessive cost. Fourth alternative way of setting standard is to rely on the precautionary principle. There's two precautionary principles. One is that it's better safe to be than to be sorry, and the other is that uncertainty is no excuse. The latter one is essentially a way of shutting up people that are obnoxious in the political debate. Sometimes people argue that really we should wait until all the details of the problem are known before we can make a decision, and that is just a silly position. And one argument against that is that uncertainty is no excuse, and that is sometimes called the precautionary principle, I think, incorrectly so. The idea that you would want to wait until all the details of an environmental pollutant are known before you can take action just runs counter to everything we do. We constantly make decisions under uncertainty, and you're never certain about how things will pan out before you make a decision. When you decide to go study economics, you don't know what economics is like, right? For the next 3 years of your life will be like, nor can you predict what your career will look like compared to what it would have looked like had you not decided to study economics. But that is not a reason not to study economics, obviously. The same for getting married, right? You make a momentous decision. You don't know what life will be like with that person in 10 years' time or in 50 years' time, yet you commit yourself to at least give it a go. Um, Uncertainty is just no excuse to postpone or delay a decision. The other interpretation of the precautionary principle is that it's better safe to be sorry, is a way of setting a standard. Again, it's a one-sided approach, right? If you say it's better to be safe than to be sorry, essentially what you say, well, we don't quite know what this particular pollutant or this particular contaminant will do to us, but we're going to ban it anyway because it might be disastrous. Now, that is a fine approach if it is a one-sided problem, right? Precautionary principle holds for crossing a busy street. Because if you sort of like make a mistake there, you get run over by a car, that's pretty disastrous. Whereas the alternative is that you arrive at your destination 1 minute later, which is not nearly as disastrous as being run over by a car. And that implies that, yeah, it's better to be safe than to be sorry when the risks are indeed like one dramatic outcome and one minor detriment. But in problems where both costs and benefits are of comparable magnitude, reasoning that it's better to be safe than to be sorry, it just doesn't help you much. So safe minimum standards, best available technology, precautionary principle, all reasons sort of from the perspective that environmental problems are large and solving environmental problems is very cheap relative to the cost of the environmental pollution. And if that is not the case, then these three criteria just don't help you very much. The most popular alternative to cost-benefit analysis is just to pick a target. Typically, environmental targets are set by a small group of politicians or civil servants without much analysis at all, and it's just, well, this is the flavor of the month, this is what we're going to do. And for environmental problems that are not particularly big, that is probably not a big deal. But in other cases, for environmental problems that the solution of which cause more economic trouble, that is actually a big issue. One example there is the solutions to acid rain, where these sort of standards were set in a fairly arbitrary way, but the standards were actually set 25 years in the future, so nobody really cared about the economic implications of acid rain policy. Since the targets were set, we've learned a great deal about acid rain, and it's not nearly as big as we thought it was. And also, a lot of the problems were taken away, but yet those standards remained, and 20 years later, it cost some people a real amount of money. But that's how these arbitrary standards work. The final point that I want to make is about cost effectiveness analysis. And that is that once you've set a target, once you know what you want to achieve, even if that target is set in an arbitrary way or based on a criterion that is a bit iffy, then you can still do economic analysis. And that is where cost effectiveness analysis comes into play. And that is essentially, given a particular target, what is the cheapest way of meeting that target? Which is, of course, also part of cost-benefit analysis, because cost-benefit analysis comes in two parts. A, you set the target in the optimal way, but implicit in that, you also meet the target in the cheapest way possible. But if you take away the first part of cost benefit analysis and you sort of assume an arbitrary target, then you can still try and meet that target in the lowest cost possible. And we'll talk about how to do that when we talk about policy instruments.